Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just waiting for a couple more to join, so please just give us a second. Thank you. All right, then. Good morning, everyone. Again, as I said, welcome to this tour today through the Timken. We're so excited to be presenting this to us. This is part 3 of a lecture series that our docent Elinor has been kind enough to put together for us. So we're so excited to be here. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. While the presentation is ongoing, please keep yourself muted. If you do have a question, please feel free to save that until the end of the presentation, at which point you can either go ahead and ask that question, or if you wanted to use the chat function, there is a little chat button down at the bottom of your screen, and you can use that to add your question to the chat box, and we'd be happy to address those at the end as well. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, you can do the same in the comment section. So if you go to the comment section there and add your question, we'll be monitoring that as well, and we'd be happy to address those at the end as well. Finally, this presentation is being recorded, so please, if you would like to go back and check it out, or any of the previous presentations that have been made, the other previous lectures in the series, or anything else that the Timken has put on, please feel free to go to our social media channels, our YouTube, our Facebook, and all of the videos are listed there, and so you'd be able to kind of go back and watch those. But anyway, with nothing further to say, like I said, today is part 3 of a wonderful lecture series that Elinor has been putting together for us. Today she'll be presenting on John Singleton Copley's New York portraits. So I'll go ahead and hand this over to Elinor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Samantha. Well, good day and welcome to the 3rd and final lecture in our series on portraiture over the centuries. We began this series in the 16th century when the representation of distinctive likenesses first appeared. We then focused on the luxurious and groundbreaking portraits of Anthony van Dyck in the 17th century. Today, you'll be introduced to John Singleton Copley, Colonial America's most influential painter. The son of Irish immigrants living in Boston and largely self-taught, Copley was determined and ambitious. By the time he was 20, he'd become colonial Boston's leading portrait painter and the first American painter to live in a style and earn a social status comparable to that of his patrons. His swift ascent and sustained eminence were the result of an innate ability to handle paint and produce images that eclipsed anything executed by his predecessors in America. Through his stepfather, Peter Pelham, Copley had access to a vast collection of prints after old masters in English portraits, which he employed as the basis for historical compositions and portraits. In this way, Copley not only learned how to compose his pictures, but also catered brilliantly to the Anglophile predilections of his patrons, who coveted English-style portraits, but rarely, if ever, traveled to England. He worked in various media to please patrons, executing paintings, pastels, and miniatures with remarkable dexterity. Copley also learned his trade by copying reproductions of Italian mythological paintings. This charming juvenilia depicting Neptune and his retinue reminds us that Copley and the sitters in his day and the sitters in his later mature portraits lived along the New England coast and were deeply connected economically and psychologically to the sea. But Copley's painting output while in Boston and New York consisted almost entirely of portraits, for this was the only kind of painting for which there was a market in the American colonies. His 1760 portrait of Epps Sargent is but one example of how Copley used his stepfather's prints as a basis for his early works. Sargent leans to his right, his elbow resting on a circular plinth. This same pose and plinth can be seen in an engraving Peter Pelham made in 1726 after an earlier portrait of the architect James Gibbs. Much like one today might flip through a fashion magazine to search out a new outfit or hairstyle, Copley was utilizing pre-existing compositions for his Bostonian clients. Here's Copley at age 31, a self-portrait. He painted this miniature along with a nearly identical pastel portrait for his wife, Susanna Clark, as a wedding gift. He was 21 years old at the time. Now, in 1771, Copley accepted the invitation of Thomas Kemble, who was Margaret Kemble Gage's brother, to come to New York. And Margaret Kemble Gage is the portrait that we have in the Timken, which of course we'll talk about in a moment. At the time, Copley was a mature man of 33 and had been married for 2 years. The trip to New York was his first ever foray away from his hometown of Boston for any extended period. He'd planned the excursion with much care and great specificity as to the terms of his engagements in New York. He was very fastidious. He prearranged every aspect of the visit, including the number and sizes of pictures he would paint and the length of time he would stay. Between June 1771 and January 1772, Copley painted 37 portraits, with Mrs. Gage being the first. He met her in his studio on a Monday and began his painting that Thursday, having discussed with her the options available for the painting's composition. We don't really know what features of the portrait derived from Margaret Kemble's request, but can be fairly certain that most were upon Copley's suggestions. And we'll take a look as to why we expect that to be the case. As an officer's wife, Mrs. Gage was one of the most prominent women in the region, known throughout the middle colonies for her charming manner. She may have been the most socially prominent woman in New York at the time, and certainly one of the most engaging. A third-generation American considered a beauty, the British soldiers referred to her as Duchess. She really was colonial royalty. Copley had done a portrait of General Gage, Margaret Kemble Gage's husband, 3 years earlier in 1768, a work that was universally acknowledged to be a very masterly performance, elegantly finished and a most striking likeness. In short, it has every property that genius, judgment, and attention can bear upon it, and that's a quote. Copley executed a dignified image of an affable officer, a portrait that corresponded to his military station and captured his personality. Copley and Gage, working presumably in collaboration, arranged the composition to create an overt political statement in response to the imminent state of insurrection in Massachusetts in 1768. An awareness of the historical and political perspectives with which a late 18th century American colonist would likely have viewed the portrait reveals that Gage points emphatically to a graphic warning of the military consequences of further unlawful resistance by the colonists to the rule of the crown and parliament. General Gage's portrait was evidently composed and created with the intention that it should itself play an active role in the political process as perhaps the only means by which Gage could make a semi-public statement of his ability to respond with superior military force if the political rebellion should explode into armed conflict. The wooden baton, an unofficial though traditional emblem with classical antecedents denoting the command of an army or large force in the field, had throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries been a standard feature of formal portraits of officers who had reached the general's rank. Note the military scene in the background. The pictorial convention for 18th century portraits of senior military commanders commonly held that when a military scene was depicted in the background, this was understood to represent a prominent episode from the sitter's military career as a visual reference to the source of the sitter's fame and reputation. Now, Copley's tremendous success in New York was rooted in his ability to appeal to his sitters' desire to be portrayed on a par with their English counterparts. And what was quite the rage at this time was Turkery, dressing in the Turkish style. He offered them the option of selecting poses, settings, costumes, and coiffures from English etchings for their likenesses, thus creating for them in the space of a canvas alternative or desired appearances. In this 3/4 length portrait, we see a relaxed, serene, and confident woman seated languidly on a dark blue velvet sofa, her curved right arm and ham supporting her head. Light entering from the left illuminates Mrs. Gage's oval face. She is striking by almost any standard of beauty, with deep-set brown eyes, heavy eyebrows, long nose, and small mouth. She's depicted wearing an uncorseted, which was quite flagrant at the time, an uncorseted iridescent rose silk caftan loosely closed over a cream lace-trimmed chemise. A deep red jewel at her bosom and an embroidered dark blue belt is at her waist. Around her neck are 2 strands of delicate miniature pearls. Larger pearls are wrapped around her left elbow and entwined in her Turkish-style headscarf. The tasseled scarf is embroidered in the same dark blue and gold fabric as her belt. Her long hair is piled high on her head, falling over her right shoulder. Now, Mrs. Gage is not known to have visited Turkey, but her father was born there, and his mother was Greek, thus giving her costume some basis in reality to which she might have been drawn. Now, on colonial canvas, as at British fancy dress balls, Turkery was very popular, second only to historical costume. The Turkish trend, which was in full swing by mid-century, owed much to the compelling example of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who traveled in the Ottoman Empire for a few years just before 1720. As a fashionable and confident woman, mythologized even in her own time, Lady Mary became synonymous with Turkish style. She often wore Ottoman dress in public and invariably to masquerades, where she inspired a veritable craze for the style, fueled still later by the numerous portraits painted of her in Turkish dress. This work, dating from 1725, is by Jonathan Richardson the Younger. Indeed, if there's an exact source for Copley's portrait of Mrs. Gage, it must be Sir Godfrey Kneller's portrait of Lady Mary, which was engraved by Caroline Watson. Born in 1689, Lady Mary Wortley was an English aristocrat and lady of letters. More important than her literary achievements, however, Lady Montagu was responsible for the introduction of the smallpox inoculation to Britain and Western Europe. This medical breakthrough, which she promoted widely, later, of course, superseded by Edward Jenner's vaccination, was the first time in Western medicine that antibodies were created to secure immunity from disease. And here's a painting from 1725 of Lady Mary costumed in complete Oriental dress. It was done by Jean-Étienne Lyotard. Mercy Greenleaf Scully, whom Copley painted in 1763, now again, this is before Mrs. Gage, shares Mrs. Gage's posture. Her head, conceivably filled with untold thoughts, rests heavily on the back of her fingers, but she directs her gaze frontally, thus confronting her viewer rather than maintaining a private reverie. After painting Mrs. Gage, Copley painted this portrait of another New York woman who also shares Mrs. Gage's posture and the sofa, but not her mood. And this is known as Portrait of a Lady, also from 1771. The woman is contained in a defined moment. She's the recipient of a letter, and the viewer of her portrait has caught her in a private moment of absorption. Copley would have known the art historical precedents for portraying women with letters, love letters, good news or bad, gossip, and the use of this device for narrative effect. Mrs. Gage's portrait, however, contains no narrative. Copley provided her with no manifest reason for her informal attitude. On the contrary, rather than diffusing the implications of her reverie with props, he enhanced the portrait's erotic charge by dressing her in this Turkish style. Although her costume is not fastidiously Middle Eastern in its form or details, even this oblique interpretation would have been immediately recognizable to the sitter and her contemporaries for its connotations of pleasure, liberality, and exoticism. In her turban and uncorseted caftan, a garment that completely covers her anatomy, but titillates by virtue of loose layers that suggest strata of underclothes, Mrs. Gage participates in what must be one of the most sexually charged portraits produced in colonial America. Copley was particularly pleased with this portrait, writing, and I quote, "It is, I think, beyond compare, the best lady's portrait I ever drew," end of quote. Upon completion, he sent it to London for exhibition, after which it hung in Firle Place, the Gage family home, until it was purchased by the Timken Foundation. Now, this is a portrait of Mrs. Joseph Hooper, or Mary Harris, which was also done during his time in New York in 1771. She and her husband lived in Marblehead, Massachusetts, and they were newly rich members of the merchant class. She's portrayed as a woman who is calm, rational, and prosperous, and she's wearing the same dress as Mrs. Gage, so it was obviously a choice open to more than Mrs. Gage. Mrs. Gerathmiel Bowers, or Mary Sherburne, was done, this painting was done in 1763, and it's Mrs. Gage's most direct prototype with her Turkish style ensemble and camelback sofa. But here, Copley is not yet thought to complement the costume with an interpretive posture. Copley's portrait is based on a British mezzotint by James McArdle after a portrait of Lady Caroline Russell painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds in 1759. Copley followed this model with precision, substituting the face of the sitter for that of Lady Russell. Tradition has it that the portrait was painted about the time of the sitter's marriage in 1763, and the frame of the painting is thought to be the original. Mrs. Gage is situated in a Western context, and if there were any doubt of her predicament, the damask-covered camelback sofa locates her with some degree of specificity to a parlor in Britain or its colonies. The remarkable difference between Mrs. Gage and her contemporaries, also dressed in the Turkish style, is the informality of her image. The fact that she indeed assumes the attitude suggested by her clothing, rather than counterbalancing it with exemplary, prudish Western poise. She plays the Turkish part, fully engaging in the 18th century romantic mindset that deemed the Middle East a land of enchantment. When Copley and Mrs. Gage sat down together in advance of starting the portrait, they may have looked at any number of prints, but seemed to have settled for a composite of some of the more evocative prototypes there were to choose from. Before leaving Mrs. Gage, I'd like to make one note of the unsolved mystery surrounding her. Was she, in fact, a colonial informant? General Gage had secret plans to destroy Patriot armories in Lexington and Concord and to place key leaders into custody. An informant who was connected to the British High Command alerted the Patriots. Perhaps it was Mrs. Gage. Now, there's no proof of her complicity, but it is revealing that she and her 10 children were sent to England shortly after this in April 1775, supposedly to tend to the family estate. General Gage was recalled later that year. History is divided about the Gages after that, some accounts saying that the two remained happily managed, some saying that they were estranged ever after. The fact that Mrs. Gage had their 11th child in England perhaps speaks to the endurance of their relationship. Now, in a later portrait in 1774, Abigail Smith Babcock wears a highly interpretive Oriental ensemble, which includes a loose-fitting gown with a Grecian girdle, a turban of patterned muslin, and an ermine-trimmed mantle. She was the wife of Adam Babcock, a wealthy New Haven ship owner who supported the Patriot cause with money and ships. So let's now take a look at some of Copley's other New York portraits. He intended to stay, by the way, originally 3 months, but he stayed for 6 months. Mrs. Roger Morris is the sitter of Frederick Phillips of Phillips Manor. Folks who know New York know that Phillips Manor is north of New York in the Hudson Valley. They were one of the great Dutch families who took the side of the Loyalists, as was her husband, Roger Morris. She's clearly a person of intelligence and force of character. In this respect, the portrait is reinforced by written documents and family tradition. When the revolution made life in New York impossible for them, Colonel Morris took his family back to Yorkshire. The portrait of Mrs. Morris remained in the family there until it was brought back to America a generation ago. The tradition in the Phillips family is that George Washington was deeply interested in Mary Phillips, but she married Roger Morris, who was a loyalist. That was the difference. The clergy of the Anglo-Dutch New York community are represented by the Reverend John Ogilvie, assistant minister at Trinity Church, which is in downtown Manhattan. Graduated from Yale in 1748, he went abroad to be ordained, and on his return to America, went to Albany in the spring of 1750 as the rector of St. Peter's and a missionary to the Mohawk Indians. He could preach in English, Dutch, or the Mohawk tongue, took a lifetime interest in the spirit care of the Mohawk Indians, and served as chaplain of the Royal American Regiment during Wolfe's campaign against Quebec. After the war, he went away to Trinity in New York and worked toward the publication in 1769 of, and I quote, the Order for Morning and Evening Prayer, end of quote, in Mohawk. He's described as a man of great generosity. Dr. Ezra Stiles said of him, and I quote, Dr. Ogilvie was the only Episcopal clergyman in New York who vouchsafed to attend a Presbyterian lecture, end of quote. While in New York, Copley journeyed to Rock Hall in Lawrence, Long Island, to paint this portrait of Mary Elizabeth Martin, the eldest of 8 children of Josiah Martin, the colonial governor of North Carolina. In this portrait, one of only a handful of paintings of children executed by Copley, the elegantly gowned 9-year-old Mary Elizabeth, framed by classical columns, is frozen in mid-stride as she plays with an English spaniel dog, the favorite pet of English royalty. At the outbreak of the Revolutionary War a few years later, the Martin family returned permanently to England. Now we have a few, we have a few portraits here of the Verplanks family, and they were one of the old Dutch families who chose the Whig side. The Whigs sought independence from England, and the Tories preferred loyalty to Britain. Copley has preserved for us the clever, urbane face of the young banker, Julian Verplank, recently returned from a tour of Europe following his apprenticeship under his maternal uncle, Daniel Crommelin, in the Amsterdam banking house of Daniel Crommelin and Sons. Julian Verplank had graduated from King's College, which is now Columbia University, in 1768. And in 1788, following his return to New York, Julian was elected to the State Assembly, where he served twice as Speaker. He also became president of the Bank of New York, and in 1792 helped found the Tontine Association, a precursor of the New York Stock Exchange. Fruitful in his private life as well, Julian Verplank had 7 children. Now here's Julian's older brother, Samuel Verplank, who not only served an apprenticeship in Amsterdam, but also brought home as his bride his Dutch cousin, Judith Crommelin. A colonial deed describes Samuel as, I quote, a merchant, gentleman, citizen of New York, burgher of Amsterdam, and a governor of King's College. In 1768, he was one of the 24 founders of the New York Chamber of Commerce. When the British forces under Lord Howe occupied New York in 1776, Samuel withdrew to the family home, Mount Julian at Fishkill. His wife, Judith, remained in New York at their home at 3 Wall Street. And here's a portrait of Judith and Samuel's son, Daniel Crommelin Verplank, who was born in New York and spent the early part of his life in the family home on Lower Wall Street. He was their eldest son. While attending Columbia College, he married Elizabeth Johnson, daughter of the president of Columbia. They had 2 children. Following her death in 1789, Verplanck remarried Anne Walton, with whom he had 7 children. They lived on Wall Street until 1803 and then moved to Fishkill on Hudson, New York. He represented Dutchess County in Congress from 1803 until 1809 and was later a county judge. The portrait, of course, was painted in 1771 when Daniel was 9 years old. The little Verplanck boy playing with a pet squirrel is placed against a view traditionally believed to be that from the family home in Fishkill. The memory of him that's come down is of his life after he retired in 1804 from the house on Wall Street to Mount Julian, where he took a strong interest in agriculture and was known as, I quote, a collector of silver and a fine judge of wine. Copley achieved his position as portraitist to the merchant elite of Boston and New York because he thought and behaved like a gentleman. In an era of accelerating class divisions and political upheaval, Copley flourished. He closely identified with his patrons and, until their world collapsed on the eve of the American Revolution, captured and confirmed their values and hopes. But Copley aspired to more than provincial success, and he wanted to know how his work would be gauged by sophisticated English standards. So to find out, in 1765, he painted a portrait of his stepbrother, Henry Pelham, not as a commission, but rather for exhibition in London. And this work, A Boy with a Flying Squirrel, Henry Pelham, was calculated to demonstrate everything that Copley could do. It differed markedly from his commissioned portraits in its subtly complex composition. Here, Copley chose to paint his sitter in profile rather than using a typical frontal likeness, and has placed him behind a table that seemingly juts out into the viewer's space. Pelham dreamily gazes upward with parted lips as if in a reverie. Copley masterfully united the composition with his use of color. The rich reds of the drapery and mahogany table are picked up in the boy's ruby lips and the skin tones of his face, as well as the pink collar. Most brilliant of all, perhaps, is Copley's ability to depict a variety of textures. For example, the boy's skin and the soft duo of the squirrel, the highly polished table, and the reflections of the glass of water. Copley sent A Boy with a Flying Squirrel to London for exhibition in 1766. It garnered much praise, perhaps most importantly from Sir Joshua Reynolds, one of the leading English artists, who called this painting, I quote, a very wonderful performance, end of quote. Copley was encouraged by the positive response the painting received, and he aspired to travel to Europe for proper training. Now, an anecdote relates that the painting was delivered, this painting, unaccompanied by name or letter of instructions to Benjamin West, and West is sent to have exclaimed, quote, with a warmth and enthusiasm of which those who knew him best could scarcely believe him capable, what delicious coloring worthy of Titian himself, end of quote. In Boston, Copley was especially impacted by the increased political turmoil in the wake of the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. His father-in-law had been one of the merchants who was supposed to receive the tea dumped in the harbor. This unrest, along with the desire for the esteem and seriousness associated with urine art practices, spurred his departure for London in June of 1774. He finally fulfilled his wish to study the great works of art and left Boston to take his longed-for European grand tour. He never returned home. Following a brief respite in Rome during the summer of 1774, where Copley studied the old masters and drew as he'd rarely done before, he landed in London and remained for the rest of his life. There, his portraits proceeded from his American successors, employing in likenesses such as that of midshipman Augustus Brine, the same dazzling effects. This portrait of young Brine was painted in 1782, 7 years after Copley had arrived in England. Augustus Brine was the son of Admiral James Brine of the Royal British Navy by his first wife, Jane Knight, at the age of 13 in 1782. Brine enlisted in the Navy as a midshipman aboard the Bellecour under the command of his father. In 1790, he was made lieutenant, and 8 years later, he became a commander. During the War of 1812, he commanded the Medway and successfully captured the American brig Siren. He was named Rear Admiral in 1822. Copley continued to amaze clients with his portraits, even while establishing himself as a key player in the current rage for history painting. With the critical success of his enormous tableau called The Death of Major Pearson, Copley joined the top ranks of British painters. He was elected to the Royal Academy and won royal patronage that kept him painting until the very end of his extraordinary life. He died in 1815. And here's the last self-portrait we have of him from 1780 to 84, when he was 44. So in summary, portraits have always been more than just a record. They've been used to show the power, importance, virtue, beauty, wealth, taste, learning, or other qualities of the sitter. One might consider that with the advent of photographs, painted portraits no longer have a place in the artist's repertoire, but that's not the case. Rather, they're being reinvented in ways that are challenging the traditional aspects of the art. Give me one moment, folks, I apologize. As such, here's a portrait from 2017 by Jordan Castile called Yvonne and James. So this is a current portrait work, and artists are still using the portraiture genre as a genre that is important and still has something to say in today's art world. This brings us to the close of our lecture series covering 3 centuries of portraiture. I hope you've enjoyed our whirlwind tour of the works of Bartolomeo Veneto, Anthony van Dyck, and John Singleton Copley, and that you'll visit their works live in our collection when the Timken Museum reopens. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Back to you, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. Thank you so much. Copley's such an interesting figure, and I think, you know, his portraits really kind of capture this like really interesting, he's really great at faces, like you said about our portrait in the Timken. Like, she has this incredible look on her. I've always thought when I look at you know, kind of her portrait, she's incredible. So it's great to see all the rest of his portraits. So thank you so much. At this
You're
point,
quite welcome.
Yeah, at this point, we'd like to open it up to any questions or comments that anyone may have. So as I said previously, please feel free to either unmute yourself or you can go ahead and add questions to the chat, which I just saw some pop up right now. So let's take a look. Helen is saying, thank you so much. So thank you again, Eleanor. Katie is saying, it's interesting that we see Mary Elizabeth Martin depicted with a dog, particularly one linked to the English Empire as they traditionally meant fidelity. As you mentioned that her family returned to England during the war, could it be that the dog is meant to symbolize their fidelity to the English as a family? That's a really interesting question.
Yes, that is true. Spaniels in particular, King Charles spaniels are often included in works of royalty, to show, and they do represent fidelity to the throne. And portraits we have of children with their, mastiff dog, again, relating to royalty. And I think we had a portrait in the Anthony Van Dyck presentation where the children, of King Charles, the child had his hand on a very large dog, showing his affinity for the dog, but also that he could, in effect, control the dog as, the empire was being controlled by Charles I. It was a mastiff. It was a very large dog.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it could be that that dog is there to kind of, represent, any relation to royalty or fidelity to loyalty. So yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you so much, Katie. If anyone has any other questions or comments, we'd be happy to take those now as well. Actually, oh, go ahead. Katie also has another question. It appears that Mrs. Drumathal Bowers has a damask rose on her chest, a sign of kindness and grace. The damask rose is also believed to have brought over to Europe during the Crusades. Could this also be a subtle sign of Turkey, while also signifying her grace
Ah,
and kindness as a wife and
that's
woman?
interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not particularly aware of that, but that is a wonderful observation. Thank you for that history of the rose being brought over to Europe during the Crusades. So certainly symbolism in these paintings was rampant, and I would not therefore be surprised if that, each prop, as we saw in the turned down flower that Mary Villiers was holding, in the Anthony Van Dyck, portrait. Flowers often were symbolic. So that's a wonderful, recognition, and thank you for identifying that. It may well be the case.
Yeah. Thank you so much again, Katie. Um, while maybe people have other questions, I was actually going to ask you, Eleanor, now that you've kind of done this whole portrait series, do you have a favorite portrait in the Timken?
um, I I I often go back to Veneto, even his brilliant costumes, of folks, and the fact that he was the one of the first who did distinctive portraits of individuals, up until that time. Before the Renaissance, portraits were just kind of generic likenesses, or they were very stiff figures.
Mhm.
And, if we look at the left here of Lady in the Green Dress, it shows personality, it shows emotion. So I think he was groundbreaking. Having said that, Van Dyck influenced portraiture for over 300 years. So I think, with his lavish and luxurious works, of royalty, he still influences, I think, royal portraits to this day.
Yeah.
So I think both those two vie for being my favorite.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just mentioned now too the fabrics, actually, now just looking at these three all together, all three of them, the
Yes,
fabrics are amazing in them. And so
amazing. Yeah.
another thing that shows up in portraiture a lot that you don't necessarily think about. It's a nice way for the artist to kind of show off their ability to paint fabrics in addition to a wonderful portrait. So yeah, these are it's great that we have these at the Timken, to have that opportunity to be able to see them once the museum opens, of course. To have these masters in San Diego is a fantastic opportunity. Great. Awesome. All right. So I don't think I see any other questions. So again, thank you so much to Elinor for putting together. Oh, yeah, I believe we addressed both of Katie's questions. So if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free. But otherwise, as I mentioned before, this lecture, as well as all of the others put on by the Timken, have been recorded and are put on our social media channels. So please feel free to go ahead and check those out if you would like, on our Facebook or YouTube, any of our other social media channels. You can also, if you are interested in other tours put on by the Timken, please go ahead to our website and check out our kind of scheduled list of events. We have regular tours being presented pretty much every week. So please feel free to drop into those and see what else our lovely docents have prepared to kind of show us the Timken while the museum is still closed. So again, thank you so much to Elinor. This was a fantastic series, so interesting and so enlightening. So thank you again. And otherwise, everyone have a fantastic day. Have a fantastic rest of your day. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.